Hey guys, so for this video I will be playing Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech to give everybody who listens a moral foundation for which to base discrimination and racism, or the lack thereof really, and what that should look like in our country versus what it's becoming. And there is a conspiracy trying to turn this against and tip the balance against whites and males. So here we go.
Capital to cash a check.
Sorry.
I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of our nation. Five score years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negro lives on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. 100 years later, the Negro is still languished in the corners of American society and finds himself in exile in his own land. And so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition.
So first of all, I would like to say to the homosexually active and the actively transgender out there that your own shameful condition was caused by your own actions. Homosexual activity and acting on transgender impulses is wrong. It was a decade and a half ago, and it still is today, even though we as a society have come to ignore that fact. And well, whether you were Christian or atheist back a decade and a half ago, that was generally accepted that it was wrong. So what happened? Well, first of all, you have politicians, at least in Washington state government, who basically complained about discrimination, even though, and where there was some, but it was misapplied. To those who have the temptations but do not act on those impulses, I will say that your cause is just if you have been bullied or even worse, abused. Having said that, though, abuse respects no identity, only the need for power. But after all that, then we started to, without realizing it, come to see the homosexually active and the actively transgender lumped in with all homosexuals and all transgenders, and just seen them all as the perceived victim. So my other purpose in making this video is, let's raise our head above our emotions and above our apathy and start calling out the homosexually active and the actively transgender. And restore these social morals that used to be in place, and whether you cared if there was a God or not, you generally accepted. And to the homosexuals who do and do not act on those impulses is what I've heard studies that it's oftentimes the cause of homosexuality is a wounded relationship with the person of the same, the parent of the same gender. Which I have too, but not quite, probably to the same extent that you do. I guess what I'd like to say to you is, here are my suggestions for how to not act on it. Do it like the addicts. Take it one day at a time. Go seek out a counselor. Go seek out a homosexual who has been able to abstain, and even better, work through the impulses. I can probably refer you to one or two if you want. And to the transgenders out there, I don't know what causes what used to be called gender identity disorder, and I'll still call it that. Maybe your mother dressed you up in girl clothes. Or girls, maybe you've conditioned to be like men in this overly feminist society. I don't know. But, yeah, I don't know what to tell you except for maybe I'm sorry, and I'd help any way I can, which probably isn't that much. But anyways, moving on.
Since we've come to our nation's capital to cash a check, when the architects of our republic wrote the magnificent words of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, they were signing a promissory note to which every American was to fall heir. This note was a promise that all men, yes, black men as well as white men.
Just as a side note, it's worth noting that Dr. King uses men to refer to both men and women here, something that the radical left seems to be really offended at, and they say will overthrow the patriarchy, which, let's be honest, most women wear the pants in the home in this day and age. And I think is being made a bigger deal than it really should be. Moving on.
Would be guaranteed the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It is obvious today that America has defaulted on this promissory note insofar as her citizens of color are concerned. Instead of honoring this sacred obligation, America has given the Negro people a bad check, a check which has come back marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the Bank of Justice is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that there are insufficient funds in the great vaults of opportunity of this nation.
I kind of wonder if the Bank of Justice is getting bankrupt. I mean, we see homosexually actives and actively transgenders, and going about doing what they do completely unrebuked. And back in the 60s, at least, homosexual activity could land you in jail. And yeah, there should always be sufficient funds in the Bank of Justice. Justice is fairness, answering for what is right and for what is wrong. And the vaults of opportunity, as Dr. King called them, should be available to all good Americans, and ideally everybody else.
We've come to cash this check, a check that will give us upon demand the riches of freedom and the security of justice. also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promises of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children.
So with that, granted things aren't that bad yet, but the stage is being set where we could lose a lot of freedom real quickly. So to the whites out there and the males, I say, let's cash our check. Our check for the freedom of speech, as well as to be as free from discrimination and prejudice as any other identity group in this country. Also worth noting, Dr. King mentions the solid rock of brotherhood, which makes it sound like he's not calling for a Hobbesian nightmare of identity groups warring for power, to use Jordan Peterson's words, but reconciliation and, as he says, brotherhood.
It would be fatal for the nation to overlook the urgency of the moment. This sweltering summit of the Negro's legitimate discontent will not pass until there is an invigorating autumn of freedom and equality. 1963 is not an end, but a beginning. Those who hope that the Negro needed to blow off steam and will now be content will have a rude awakening if the nation returns to business as usual. There will be neither rest nor tranquility in America until the Negro is granted his citizenship rights. The whirlwinds of revolt will continue to shake the foundations of our nation until the bright day of justice emerges. But that is something that I must say to my people who stand on the warm threshold which leads into the palace of justice. In the process of gaining our rightful place, we must not be guilty of wrongful deeds. Let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from the cup of bitterness and hatred. We must forever conduct our struggle on the high plane of dignity and discipline. We must not allow our creative protests to degenerate into physical violence. Again and again, we must rise to the majestic heights of meeting physical force with soul force. The marvelous new militancy which has engulfed the Negro community must not lead us to a distrust of all white people. For many of our white brothers, as evidenced by their presence here today, have come to realize that their destiny is tied up with our destiny. They have come to realize that their freedom is inextricably bound to our freedom. We cannot walk alone.
And I see this with the radical left. I see them I see them still blaming whites for what happened, even though, as a general rule, we haven't done anything for the past 40 years. I understand that there are exceptions, but yeah, some of them still have not lost that hate for white people. I've even heard of one person, I think it was a professor at some college, tweeting, "All I want for Christmas is a white genocide." Now, I understand this is an exception, but this is something that you never would have heard. Now, granted, there was a social media 40 years ago. You certainly would not have heard such a thing then. And I'm guilty, too, on the other side, of being a little bit bitter about how some whites and some boys in school get treated by their teachers, and how some whites are treated in the workplace, or at least men. So at some point, we, rather than be divided, and again, I'm speaking as a hypocrite, we all need to build on a same moral foundation and lock arms across the identity gaps. Although, and I have to say, I do like the number of obviously black people in Dr. King's audience who were in sole agreement with his peaceful protest, which also to the straight people out there, we may have to pay a similar consequence when calling out the homosexually active and the actively transgender. As unfortunately, it is seen as discrimination in the law, whether or not we are actually treating them unkindly or not. They call it hate across the board.
And as we walk, we must make the pledge that we shall always march ahead. We cannot turn back. There are those who are asking the devotees of civil rights, when will you be satisfied? We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality. We can never be satisfied as long as our body is heavy with the fatigue of travel, cannot gain lodging in the motels of the highways and the hotels of the cities. We cannot be satisfied as long as the Negro's basic mobility is from a smaller ghetto to a larger one. We can never be satisfied as long as our children are stripped of their selfhood and robbed of their dignity by signs stating for whites only. We cannot be satisfied as long as a Negro in Mississippi cannot vote and a Negro in New York believes he has nothing for which to vote. No, we are not satisfied, and we will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like waters and righteousness like a mighty stream. I am not unmindful that some of you have come here out of great trials and tribulations. Some of you have come fresh from narrow jail cells. Some of you have come from areas where your quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality. You have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith.
So I love what he's about to say next, and I'll probably rewind it just a little bit. But before I do, I'm going to speak to both the left and the right, to the homosexuals, active and not, and to the transgenders, active and not. However hard growing up may have been for you, I don't think you have anything on the blacks of the 60s and earlier. And for that matter, For the white folks who are seeing how we are being mistreated on occasion throughout the country, it's still not, things are still pretty good, but it's time to speak up before things get really bad, and they could get bad really quick. Now I will rewind this, just because as a Christian, I do believe in Dr. King's next words.
Quest for freedom left you battered by the storms of persecution and staggered by the winds of police brutality.
Sorry, a little bit further back than I wanted to
You
go.
have been the veterans of creative suffering. Continue to work with the faith that unearned suffering is redemptive.
One thing I see today, and we saw it with Ms. Monopoly, how girls get 240 for pass and go and guys get 200 or whatever the heck it was. And as well as some instances, like my uncle sees women actively getting promoted above men who are equally qualified. For those who think that making whites suffer because some whites made other races suffer in earlier days, you are making whites who were born after such a time, you are putting on them what he calls unearned suffering. Suffering they individually never earned in their life. At least not for being white.
Go back to Mississippi. Go back to Alabama. Go back to South Carolina. Go back to Georgia. Go back to Louisiana. Go back to the slums and ghettos of our northern cities. Knowing that somehow this situation can and will be changed. Let us not...
Applicable to us too. Let's stand where we are and fight. Let's as innocuously as possible call the transgender by their real gender. Let's, as tough lovingly as possible, and I emphasize the lovingly of tough lovingly, rebuke, call out, chastise the homosexually active. Another option might be, if you think you can help them more than that, then obviously do it. Most I can do is tell them a couple facts I've heard and just refer them to a couple people, or rebuke them myself.
In the valley of despair, I say to you today, my friend, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And I think that goes for homosexuals and transgenders too. Is where people say that you hear stuff like you're created the way you're meant to be. That is false. No one is created the way they're meant to be. Nobody's created the way they're meant to be. Everyone, Christ included, is created just the way they're meant to start. And if you are meant to start gay, you are meant to start gay. Personally, I don't think you are actually born gay. I think you are born with a weakness. Just like a little child isn't born with a bad temper, they're probably born with a weakness. But life happens. You break. We all break at some point in time.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that one...
Now he is definitely talking about reconciliation. And my guess is, oh, by the way, I'm reminded, and this is a little bit off topic, but I'm reminded, to the white people who are taught without being told to be ashamed of that they are white, my guess is, and this rings true to me, that Dr. King would not have us be ashamed of what we did. He would have us repent and move on.
Even the state of Mississippi, a state sweltering with the heat of injustice, sweltering with the heat of oppression, will be transformed into an oasis of freedom and justice. I have a dream.
Every square inch of America should be that.
That my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
And there you heard it, the most commonly quoted portion of the I Have a Dream speech, that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they are not judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Dr. King's dream was not that people would not be, what's the word? I once did a service project at South Shore K-8 in Seattle, Washington, where on there they had a sign that basically excused gays, excused Mexicans who had crossed the border, said that did not acknowledge the exception of Muslims who are terrorists, and whatever. That might have been fine, except that, well, actually, no, it's not fine. But it should have said something like, should have said something like, at least to the Mexicans, actually, I'll use an example, the Muslims. We know that 5% to 33%, only 5% to 33% of you are actually terrorists, statistically speaking. I've heard both. For example, basically acknowledging that, yeah, there are some bad ones, but there are good there. But not once did they mention, and they also said, dear female students, you are not objects. Men will respect you, demand it, or something to that effect. You know, they had every single perceived victim. But what bugged me more is that they didn't have anything like, dear male students, we know that you're respectful, if they're going to label them all, or dear white students, we know that you aren't racist. And they also had a sign in there that said, thank you, Dr. King, such and such zip code is living the dream. And what I want to say to them, and to those of you who are at South Shore K-8, student or teacher, you are not living the dream. You might think you are, but you're not. Dr. King's dream was that you are judged by your character, not by the color of your skin. And in this case, I think we can extend it to sexual orientation and religion. And he certainly did not have a dream of whites being taught to be ashamed that they're white, or males taught to be ashamed that they're males, and being evidently called out while the rest, whether they should be or not, are excused. No, you are not living the dream. Start doing so.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama, with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification. One day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Again, he's talking about brotherhood. He is not talking about whites or boys being made to be ashamed, as we hear about in our schools, and judging by that poster at South Shore K-8, I have to assume they are. I just looked for the heck of it. I looked up nullification. I guess it's a legal term, at least constitutionally, where a state, the theory that a state can nullify federal law or invalidate it in its own state. Moving on.
I have a dream that one day every valley shall be exalted, and every hill and mountain shall be made low, the rough places will be made plain, and the crooked places will be made straight, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. This is our hope. This is the faith that I go back to the South with. With this faith, we will be able to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope. With this faith, we will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. With this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing that we will be free one day.
And I think we can say the same thing of us. It's obvious to me that we have strayed from his dream. I think we had it for like maybe the 80s through the early 2000s, but no, we have strayed from it. Let's us take hope. Let's us... it's obvious our nation's divided. Let's reach across the aisle, shake hands, and to some extent see our similarities before our differences, but also, and I speak as a hypocrite because I'm not great at forgiveness, but forgive each other. And have this brotherhood and unity that Dr. King wanted in our nation between races, and in our day, not between just races, but also sexual orientations, religions, and to these conspirators, if they are willing, who are so begrudged against the numerical and economic majority, to try and flip the tables and oppress them. And strive for real freedom in this country. But again, actions are not without consequence. He didn't preach anything otherwise, nor did our founding fathers.
This will be the day when all of God's children will be able to sing with new meaning, "My country, tears of thee. Sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to be a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring.
And if we don't get this, and if we don't achieve this, the true Christians will when Christ comes again. This is the society he will create, at least partly, where all are free and all are equal in the sight of God.
Ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped Rockies of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring, and when this happens, when we allow freedom ring, when we let it ring from every village and every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to speed up that day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, we are free at last.
Let freedom ring.